All right, I just wanted to welcome everybody. I'm happy that you're here. Good to see all these faces, even if we can't see each other, at the synagogue, but we're here. And I want to especially thank you, the ones that have joined or rejoined Sisterhood. I encourage you to please pay your dues. And if you are not a member, please do become a member of Sisterhood. Supporting Sisterhood is supporting Beth Yeshurun, and we're trying to bring you great programs. Hasn't been too easy during this time, but here we are, and happy to see you all. And Barbara, it's all yours.
Okay. Well, again, I ditto everything Vicki just said. Thank you for joining us to be able to provide this program for you, 100 years, then and now. And I'm really thrilled to introduce you to Marjorie Marcus. We've gotten to know her through our practices and our discussions. She's delightful. She lives in Florida. She is so creative. Her background is Congregation Beth Yeshurun, in case you didn't recognize it, but just a little bit about her. She holds a PhD in education. She retired from the Broward County Public School System. She was an administrator and an English teacher. And her first love of literature started way back when she read Charlotte's Web. And she has been an enthusiast and just passionate about literature and education ever since then. She speaks all the time. She's on a circuit with a number of universities, and she's spoken to other sisterhood programs. This is one of the favorites 100 years ago, then and now, but she also has a great program called, Murder and Miss You Goth, a number of murder mysteries with a Jewish twist. And also she has another series called The Best of Times, where she talks about covers on magazines, some of the trends and some of the issues that were big in the day. So she's a wealth of knowledge and very entertaining. And without further ado, I give you Marjorie. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm definitely moving to Houston, Texas. As Barbara said, Barbara and Vicki and I have met several times, and they are totally delightful. And thank you to Jennifer for having somebody who really knows what she's doing, emceeing, and Barbara and Vicki, you found me, and I'm so grateful. So thank you. My topic today is 100 years ago, then and now. And I was trying to think of something that could really represent the difference in technology between today and 100 years ago, and the telephone. So the telephone, of course, was patented by Alexander Graham Bell in the 1870s, but it took until 1920, 100 years ago, for somebody to figure out, hey, we can put that telephone on a wall. So the wall phone was invented 100 years ago. And then, of course, on the right side of the screen, it's the cell phone that none of us can do without. We carry a computer in our pocket everywhere we go. And oh yes, we can make telephone calls on it as well. But I'm going to tell you before I get started that I am cheating a little bit, because I'm going to go back in a few cases 105 years. So I hope that you're okay with that. And one of the things that I like to do to get my audiences warmed up is I like to give you a little quiz. And even though I can't hear you, I'm going to be able to read your lips. So just scream out the answers. So I want to know if you can tell which century each of these items occurred. For instance, Washington in Chaos, was that in the 20th century or the 21st century? How about gender inequality? And some of you might be saying, well, that's definitely the 20th century. But even today in the 21st century, women make 85 cents to every dollar that a man makes. Border problems with Mexico, anyone? How about quarantines and face masks? And of course, you figured it out already. Each of these items has occurred in both centuries. Let's start with looking at politics at home. So we have the Great War in 1914, headline from the paper, Germany declares war. All of Europe is engulfed. It was the Great War. It was the war to end all wars. 40 million people killed in World War I, changed the face of Europe. The United States, of course, did not get in until 1917, almost to the end of the war. But what you saw on the battlefields of the Great War, you saw trench warfare, hand-to-hand combat. You saw the tank used for the very first time in World War I, hand grenades, mortar shells. So just a devastating war. And then 4 years later, 1918, the armistice is signed. Headaches from Mexico sound familiar. Of course, remember how Mexico was going to pay for the wall, but 100 years ago, it was Pancho Villa and his band of bandits that plagued New Mexico and, of course, you know, southern Texas. So Pancho Villa had anywhere between 500 to 1,000 men, and they would make incursion raids into South Texas, into Mexico, burn, pillage, just cause all kinds of problems. So Congress commissioned General John J. Pershing to take 10,000 men, get down to Texas, and hunt down that Pancho Villa. Pershing chased Villa for 1 year and never did find him. But Pershing had much better luck. He was made head of the American forces in Europe during World War I and did much better. Immigration issues sound familiar. 100 years ago, this country was dealing with immigration issues just as it is today. If you take a look at that political cartoon on the left, that is a kind of wall, but it's a literacy wall. Those strange things poking out of the wall, those are fountain pens. Because in 1916, Congress passed a law that said all immigrants coming to this country must be able to read and copy sections of the American Constitution. So, of course, very, very few immigrants could do that. And then the law was changed. Okay, well, then they just have to prove to us that they are literate in their own language by writing 4 or 5 sentences in their native language. But interestingly, Mexicans were excluded from the literacy test because we needed them to work the fields as migrant workers. So the literacy test was in play for a while, but that wasn't working very well. So then the United States went to a quota system. And you can see in that cartoon on the right, Uncle Sam cutting off the quota of European immigrants at about 3%. And take a look at this quote here. This quote was said by the chairman of the House Committee on Immigration in 1919. The greatest menace today is the open door that it affords to the ignorant hordes from Eastern and Southern Europe. And I'm pretty sure that my grandparents were part of those that he was trying to keep out in 1910. If you take Eastern and Southern Europe and you substitute Central America, it sounds like something that might be coming out of the government today. And of course, we know what the battle was like for votes for women 100 years ago. Who do you think might possibly have said this quote? The history of the past is but one long struggle upward to equality. When I first saw that quote, I thought it was said by Martin Luther King Jr., but actually it was said by a suffragette talking about what women have to do to get the vote. And look at that cartoon. There's George Washington disgusted with these women who dare to lobby for the vote. Did I save my country for this, he says. And of course, their people were very passionate both ways about either denying women the vote or giving women the vote. And I know it's very hard for us 100 years later to think that there would even be an issue about women voting. So take a look at that political cartoon on the left. How could women possibly be expected to vote? Because our minds are so full of husbands and family and babies and chocolates and letter writing. We don't have any room in our minds for important things like voting. Or what would happen, look at the cartoon in the middle. What would happen if women get the vote and they get all dressed up and they go off to the ballot box, and what happens? Who's stuck at home with the kids? So this was a warning of what would happen if you vote for giving women the right to the ballot box. And of course, there were people, great sentiment, give women the vote. And here you have these little children and they're parading around and they're in effect saying, think about it, Father. Think about everything Mother does for you. She deserves the vote. But you know, Texas, as you know from your history, was really on the forefront of giving women the vote, sort of. In 1918, the Texas legislature passed a law that permitted women to vote, but only in primaries. And I'm sure you know this, you probably learned this in grammar school. I just learned it recently. So I guess it's the idea that you can choose the candidate, but after the candidate is chosen, you can't actually vote for the candidate. And that's a picture of women in Austin, Texas, registering to vote. So thousands and thousands and thousands of women throughout Texas took advantage of that 1918 law. But of course, we had to wait a little bit longer for the rest of the country to catch up with Texas. Every day, suffragettes would stand in front of the White House. They were called silent sentinels, starting in about 1915, 1916. And they would stand there every day, no matter what the weather. And we know that Washington, D.C. can have some pretty rough winters. And they would hold these signs up. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? The president was Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson was very lukewarm about giving women the vote. And every day he would pass these women and he would tip his hat to them, going and coming. But he really wasn't very interested in getting involved with women and voting until something happened in 1917 that got him on board. In 1917, for some reason, the police in Washington, D.C. charged the silent protesters. They beat them to the ground, they dragged them to jail, and the publicity was terrible. And you could see it's like locking up grandma. And then the call became Kaiser Wilson, and they were comparing Woodrow Wilson to the German Kaiser. And the publicity was terrible. And Wilson's wife was starting to really work on him. You gotta get on board with giving women the vote. So Wilson throws his support. In fact, he says in that poster, I intend to vote for women's suffrage. He says, I'm going back to New Jersey to vote. That's where he was from. And I think New Jersey will profit from having women vote. So Congress passes the 19th Amendment on June 4th, 1919 by a great majority. And Texas, you are right there 2 weeks later. Texas ratifies the 19th Amendment. You're one of the early states. So the 19th Amendment, or any amendment, has to be ratified by enough states to make it the law of the land. And for this amendment, they needed 36 states to ratify it, to agree to the amendment. So Texas is right up there at the beginning. It takes more than 1 year until we get 36 votes. So in August of 1920, Tennessee, in a very tight vote, throws the amendment over the top, And now women throughout the country can vote. But I live in Florida, and you probably remember the 2000 election, Gore v. Bush, and the hanging chads and the butterfly ballot and all of that. So Florida has really been quite the laughingstock of people when it comes to voting. And there was an article in the paper the other day that said, this year is going to be different. Florida is ready for the vote. Well, I'm wondering if you could possibly imagine that Florida got around to ratifying the 19th Amendment in 1969. Now, of course, women could vote in Florida because it was a federal law. But yeah, it took a while in Florida. But I'm here to tell you, Florida isn't the last state to ratify the amendment. You want to guess? Guess, scream out. What state do you think was the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment in 1985? So I hear people saying Arkansas, and I hear people saying Louisiana. You're close. Mississippi finally ratified it 30 years ago. So let's take a look at presidential elections. We're about to have an election in, 3 weeks? So the election of 1916. So Woodrow Wilson is running against Charles Evans Hughes. And Woodrow Wilson is running for a second term. He'd had a pretty good first term. He was known as a progressive. I'll talk a little bit about that. But Charles Evans Hughes was wildly popular. He was a Supreme Court justice, and he stepped down for the Supreme Court as the Republican candidate against Wilson, the Democrat. And Wilson had these really limp slogans. First slogan, he has kept us out of war. Okay, well, we know what's going to happen with that one, but this is actually my favorite. Wilson had posters that said, never swap horses when you're crossing the stream. We know what we have. We don't know what we're going to get. So just go ahead and vote for me. So the election was pretty close. And we know, of course, Wilson wins. And then 6 months afterwards, what happens? He goes to Congress and asks for a declaration of war. So that whole business about keeping us out of war really didn't help very much. But Wilson had a very complicated legacy. He was known as a progressive. He gave us the Federal Trade Commission, antitrust laws, child labor laws, National Park Service, and he gave us Justice Louis Brandeis, who served so nobly and was considered to be one of the best Supreme Court justices, of course, the first Jewish justice. His confirmation battle was so ugly. It was laced with anti-Semitism. It went on for 4 months. Brett Kavanaugh thought he had a hard time, but finally, the Judiciary Committee could not deny Brandeis, and he served for over 20 years as a very notable Supreme Court justice, making law, especially in the area of privacy law. But Wilson, despite all of these achievements, was a bigot. He was a racist. He appointed Southern racists to his cabinet. He did nothing about Jim Crow laws in the South, and he actively discouraged African Americans from applying to Princeton University when he was president of Princeton. So not too long ago, you might remember about a year ago, there was a student protest about taking Wilson's name off the building. His name was on the building of international politics, and they did. Princeton took Wilson's name off the building. So very, very complicated presidency. Then here comes 1920, and this is the very first election 100 years ago, almost exactly, in which women will vote. So the Republican candidate is Warren G. Harding, who was the senator from Ohio. And the Democratic candidate was James Cox, who was the two-time governor of Ohio. So it was, a battle for the hearts and soul of Ohio. If you take a look at Warren Harding, he turned out to be one of the worst presidents we have ever had. He is always, when people make these lists of the 10 worst presidents, he's always, the top of the list or the bottom of the list. Lots of scandal, terrible, terrible president. And one historian said, Warren Harding is the best example of why you should never vote for a man just because he looks presidential. And look how presidential he looks, a disaster. So Warren Harding actually dies very suddenly in office. He's president for 3 years and he dies. And his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, becomes president. And then Calvin Coolidge will win his own term in 1924. And look who the Democratic candidate was for vice president. And that, of course, was FDR, who will go on to be a 3-term president, winning in 1932. So the vice presidential candidates were very interesting. So I'm showing you the election map of 100 years ago. It was a landslide for Harding. And you can see the number of electoral votes here. But what I find so interesting about this map, look at the South. Do you remember when the South was a solid blue block? You could count on every state in the South for going Democratic. So look at that, and then look at this. This is the election map of Trump versus Hillary Clinton. Not so close electorally, but look at the South, all red. So it'll be very interesting when I do this lecture in a month from now, and we'll have another map. Who knows what that map will look like? So as we know, the Electoral College, which goes on to have the ultimate say in who's president, you have to win 270 electoral votes to be president. And we know that the electoral votes are based on population. So I thought you would find this interesting. Look at the number of electoral votes based on population 100 years ago. California only had 13 electoral votes 100 years ago. Now they have 55, the highest number of electoral votes. Look at Florida. There was nobody living in Florida 100 years ago. Now we have 29 votes. Look at Texas. Look at these southern states. 100 years ago, Texas had 20 electoral votes. Today, 38. And then New York and Pennsylvania, they lost population. New York went from 45 votes to 29, and Pennsylvania from 38 to 20. So people say it's almost as if we took the country in the past 100 years and we turned it on its side and we shook it, and the population drifted south. Half the people lived in the city, half the people lived in the country. Starting at about 1916, we have what we call the Great Migration, when millions and millions of African Americans left their South and went to the North. They went to Chicago, Detroit, and this picture is a picture of Harlem. And we have that period of time in the 1930s called the Harlem Renaissance, which gave us some great African-American writers like Zora Neale Hurston, Jacob Lawrence, the painter. But half the people, many, many people still lived in the country. But if you lived in the city and you got a good job, you wanted to join a union. And these were the years, 100 years ago, that unions were gaining strength. Women were in the workplace, and women went on strike for better working conditions. There were women's unions, and of course, the garment workers' unions assured that the garment workers had good salaries and safe living conditions. So if you have a good job, what's the next thing you want? You want a house. And you can buy a house 100 years ago in the Sears and Roebuck catalog. You didn't even have to bother with a real estate agent. You just sat down with the catalog and you picked the house you wanted. And this charmer on the right, if you went to buy it, it would be $4,000. But if you bought it in the Sears and Roebuck catalog, it was about $2,000. Of course, the problem is that you had to assemble it yourself. It came in boxes, and the boxes were delivered to the train station. So you had to go to the train station. You probably had to pick up 1,000 boxes, bring them to your lot, and build the house yourself. However, the house did not come with plumbing or electricity. You were on your own for that. And if you couldn't afford $2,000 in the Sears and Roebuck catalog, if you had $295, you could buy that cute little bungalow. So what was life like for a woman 100 years ago? Well, one thing is that women started to speak up for comfort. And many, many women loved the beach, but they were really tired of those big balloony bathing suits. They were more covered up on the beach than they were at home. And it took that woman on the left, her name is Annette Kellerman, to design the very first one-piece bathing suit. So Annette Kellerman was actually a very well-known actress. She was the Esther Williams of her time. Remember Esther Williams? She used to star in swimming. She would do all kinds of aquatic acrobatics in the water. So Annette Kellerman was like that, and she could not play these roles in those big, huge, voluminous bathing suits. So she invented that bathing suit. And it is true, it does show off her figure, but it also covers her legs. And then, of course, this was the age in which people were starting to harness electricity. And Western Electric has the first electric vacuum cleaner. And you plug in the vacuum cleaner and your work is done for you. So how many of you vacuum dressed like the Statue of Liberty? Like this woman in the picture. Look how happy she is to be vacuuming. And then, of course, the woman on the left is so excited because she has the first electric washing machine. So all she has to do is plug the washing machine in. She puts the clothes in the basket agitates, and then when it's done, she pulls the clothing out of the basket, and all she has to do is put it through the wringer. And I'm old enough, I think I remember my grandmother have one of these, because I remember her doing something with the wringer. And of course, the electric refrigerator was invented 100 years ago. So when electric refrigerators first came out, they had their motor at the top. Before the electric refrigerator, of course, there were those ice boxes. And I sort of remember my grandmother's ice box too, where the iceman would come with a chunk of ice and put it in the ice box. But Frigidaire in 1919 came up with the first self-contained refrigerator. And there it is. It's made of wood, and the motor is in one of those compartments. But you know what else happened 100 years ago in the life of women? The Women's League was founded by Matilda Roth Schechter. Matilda Roth Schechter, the wife of Solomon Schechter, the great rabbi who was president of the Jewish Theological Seminary, worked with 100 women at the Jewish seminary to come up with a organization that would help conservative Jewish women. And when she was asked in an interview, what does the Women's League stand for? She said, we stand for everything Jewish and American. If you take a look at the logo, it's a W for women, but it looks very much like a menorah. It has a flame because women are keepers of the flame. And the Hebrew says, it's the logo. How beautiful is our heritage. And today, I read recently the Women's League has about 400 sisterhoods or more across the country. So medicine has come a long way in the past 100 years. This is one of my favorite medicines. It's made by the Bayer Company and it's called Heroin. It is a cough syrup. It will target any of your coughs, and it's made of heroin hydrochloride. And if that doesn't knock you out, this cough syrup on the right will. This cough syrup has alcohol, cannabis, chloroform, and morpheus. So just one, I think 1 teaspoon of that, you're probably out for a week. Radium, believe it or not, was an ingredient in some medicines and in some cosmetics. There was a belief that by adding radium to cosmetics would give a woman a healthy glow. So women were actually radiating themselves by putting on some of these cold creams. But what started to happen, there seemed to be a time in which many young women working in China factories were dying at a very high rate. And so there was some investigations done. And what they found out was these women who were dying, their job was to paint the China patterns. So they would take a very small brush, they would dip it in radiated paint, and then to get a good tip on the paint, they would put it in their mouths and then they would paint. And this, of course, after years of doing this, you would die of radium poisoning. So finally, the country discovered that. So you can't really talk about 100 years ago without talking about the pandemic of the Spanish flu. So here is a picture of Fort Riley, Kansas. In March of 1918, 1 soldier came down with the flu. And in 2 weeks, thousands of soldiers at Fort Riley contracted this flu. The Spanish flu, of course, was very catching, very much like COVID today, but you could catch it much faster. The incubation period for Spanish flu was anywhere from 3 to 5 days, and sometimes it was called the 3-day flu, and of course it was deadly. But the name Spanish flu is a misnomer. You can't blame Spain for it. In fact, Spain had no cases of the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu probably originated on the battlefields of Europe, in Germany and France. And soldiers were getting sick and they were dying by the hundreds. And the governments, including the United States government, when we got into it, wanted to keep this news out of the paper. They thought that it was hard enough that people were dying fighting. They didn't want the world to know that soldiers were dying of the flu. Spain was neutral in World War I. Spain did not fight in World War I. So the Spanish papers were the only papers to report on the flu. So if you wanted information about the flu, you had to read a Spanish paper. So Spain became associated with the flu. The government was knee-deep in the war. For the most part, the government felt that if it really paid too much attention to the Spanish flu, it would be bad for morale overseas and in this country. So the government showed very little leadership. It was up to the cities and up to the states. So on the left there, you see that is a policeman in San Francisco giving it to somebody who's not wearing a mask. And evidently, about 100 years ago, spitting was very popular on the streets. And I found so many of these signs that were up all across the country telling people to stop spitting because spitting spreads death. Philadelphia is a very good example of what happened when you ignored the health professionals. The newspapers would not run any articles, for the most part, about the flu. The health professionals begged Philadelphia not to hold this parade. Many cities held these bond parades, you know, like we buy government bonds, so they would have these big parades, and it was to support the war effort. And in 1918, Philadelphia, despite the pleas of the health professionals, went ahead and had this parade. 200,000 people lined the streets of Philadelphia. 5 days later, 13,000 people who attended the parade were dead. Houston did better. October of 1918 was the second wave. Just as now, 100 years later, we are in our second wave as the kids go back to school and things loosen up. But the Houston Post, dramatic action to halt the epidemic, schools closed, theaters closed, public gatherings, the Houston Fathers shut the city down. And because of that, Houston had much fewer deaths than many other large cities across the country and many other cities in Texas. The Texas Board of Health puts out a mandate. Every pupil must have a clean handkerchief, which must not be laid on the top of the desk. No spitting on the floor, again, with the spitting. No sneezing or coughing except behind a handkerchief. And if you don't use your handkerchief or your mask, there's a picture of two kids in their mask, you could be suspended. So Texas was very serious about this. So when you talk about the Spanish flu, of course, you just want to take a look at, you know, some of the similarities and differences between the Spanish flu and COVID. So the Spanish flu was a bird flu. It was an H1N1 virus. COVID is a novel coronavirus. So who was at risk? Well, for the Spanish flu, interestingly, I think, children 5 and younger, and the 20 to 40 age group was the group that suffered the most deaths. Of course, we know that now adults over 65 are at great risk, and people with pre-existing conditions, of course, are at risk, and many minority communities who have multi-generational families are also at risk. So think about 100 years ago. There was really no medicine, unless you want to, you know, count that heroin laced cough syrup, non-pharmaceuticals. Bayer sold aspirin. However, Bayer was a German company. People were suspicious of it, so many people did not take aspirin. So today, of course, I read an article yesterday about antibodies and how this may be an answer, and antiviruses. And of course, there's no cure, but with oxygen treatment and ventilators, we certainly have some things in our arsenal to try to combat COVID-19. So what was the government response? In 1918, the government wanted to keep everything tight-lipped, locked up. Woodrow Wilson went to Paris to settle the Treaty of Versailles. Woodrow Wilson got the Spanish flu. Nobody knew. Now compare that, of course, to the media covering President Trump and his bout with the coronavirus. But Wilson kept it a secret. The government felt that any reference to the Spanish flu and the number of people who were dying, they felt it was sedition. It was treasonous. So Congress passed the Sedition Act of 1918, making it a federal crime to criticize the government, and criticizing its treatment of the Spanish flu would get you in big trouble. In 1920, when the epidemic was over, Congress repealed the Sedition Act. And what we have now, of course, we're living through it. We have the federal task force, we have scientists talking to us, and we have PPE and all of those things that are helping us and helping the government respond. So how'd the pandemic end? In 1920, there were 120 million people in the United States, about a third of the population that we have now. There was nothing other than herd immunity. When enough people got it, people were then well. 675,000 people died during the 2-year period of the Spanish flu. Today, we are hoping dramatically for some vaccine, probably going to be a while. But even now, you hear some government officials talking about, well, maybe we'll just wait for herd immunity. So just so interesting, so many similarities, and yet so many differences as well. So what were lifestyles like 100 years ago? Well, if you were a woman in the height of fashion, look at what you were wearing. Men, well, you look the same. You know, you have your suit, your tie, your hat, of course, your collar. You may or may not be carrying a cane. I don't think I see many men carrying canes or in collars today, or even hats. But women, not so different maybe from what women look like today. Clothing was much more colorful in 1920, 1919, because the war was over. During the war years, even when the United States wasn't in war, women tended to wear muted colors, browns, khakis, blacks. But as soon as the war was over, the bright colors came out. But do you see what's so scandalous about women's fashions? Do you see those ankles? And now women are showing their ankles. But actually, a few years later, they will show more. The flapper years weren't really until about, 1923 and up. And women, the flappers, in order to dance the Charleston, needed to have shorter dresses. And of course, they exposed their legs. And there's a picture of Benny Goodman on his clarinet while the flappers are having a great time dancing. So we talk about cars, and when you talk about 1915 up until 1920 or so, and if I asked you to think about a car that made history, you would probably say a Ford Model T or Model A, but it was actually the Cadillac that was very groundbreaking in many ways. There's an ad for the Cadillac, the car that has no crank. And you remember those old movies, we see the car being cranked? Cadillac was the very first to come out with the electric starter in 1912, and Ford didn't follow through until 1919. So if you had a Ford, you were still cranking that thing up until 1919. But to give Ford its due, when car manufacturers met in 1999 to name the car of the 20th century, they named the Ford Model T. And they named it for its design, its significant innovation, and its impact on society. So what impact did the car have? It was affordable. You could buy a Ford in 1916 that looked like this for about $300. So it made $300 was a lot of money 100 years ago, but it made it possible for the middle class to own a car. So there were some other things that happened 100 years ago. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about daylight savings time. And I know that we're on different time zones. I was telling Barbara and Vicki, this time zone lecture has been very interesting for me because you're an hour behind me. But it was Germany that invented daylight savings time. And you can see that poster. They invented daylight savings time in 1916 to give their troops an extra hour of light to fight. So the United States gets into the war, World War I in 1917, and says, well, that daylight savings time thing, I think it's a good thing. So Congress adopts daylight savings time in 1918. And there were these ads for it. It's for the man with the gun and the man with the hoe. It's going to give him extra daylight to plant and to farm. It was incredibly unpopular. Congress repealed it in 1919, but back again in World War II, and we've had it since. However, if it was up to Florida congressman, actually he's a senator, Senator Marco Rubio, every year, Senator Marco Rubio introduces into the Senate the Sunshine Protection Act. And he feels that every state should be on the same time. So if it was 7 o'clock in Houston, it would be 7 o'clock in Florida. And he does have, this bill gets more and more bipartisan support every year. It still has a very long way to go. But if that bill ever passes, you heard it here first, number one. And number two, you would set your clocks ahead in March of whatever year it is, and you would keep them there. And the only problem with that is it's light in Florida at 7 o'clock in the morning, but it's pitch black in Los Angeles. So they have to work some things out, but daylight savings time permanently may or may not be in our future. This was a decade, several decades of food creations 100 years ago. So the Planter Peanut Company had been in business for a while, and they have the idea that they want a mascot, a logo. So they have a contest, and they introduce the idea that they're going to have a contest. Send us your drawing. We're looking for a mascot. A 15-year-old boy in Virginia submits that picture on the left of a peanut. And it's a peanut that looks sort of like a man. So what did the Planters people do? They gave him a monocle and a top hat and a cane, and there is born Mr. Peanut. And all of us have lived with Mr. Peanut, many years. So for some reason, Planters decided they're done with Mr. Peanut. They don't want Mr. Peanut anymore. They're going to kill off Mr. Peanut. And they're going to do it during the Super Bowl of this year. So they make a video that was never shown, and I'll tell you why in a minute. They make a video in which Mr. Peanut saves the life of Matt Damon, the actor. He's in this little video. And Mr. Peanut falls off a tree and dies. And they're going to have this big funeral at the Super Bowl of just this past February. But what happened to derail that plan? You remember Kobe Bryant was killed in the plane crash. And smarter minds at the Planters Company decided that it was not appropriate to kill or have a funeral for Mr. Peanut so soon after the death of Kobe Bryant. So Mr. Peanut is in limbo someplace. But 100 years ago, the hamburger bun was invented, as was the hot dog on Coney Island. And James L. Kraft came up with a way to keep cheese fresh at room temperature. And this was also called the golden age of cereal. And the cereal companies were flacking their cereal as brain food and study food. So for instance, in that ad on the left, you see a little girl and she's able to study because she had a bowl of grape nuts flakes for breakfast. But my favorite one is the shredded wheat ad. And that ad asks, have you a boy problem? And then it goes on to say, even the best boy is a problem. But if you feed that boy shredded wheat, your boy will turn into a student. And Publix is our big supermarket in the South. You can tell me later what your supermarket is. But Piggly Wiggly in Memphis, Tennessee, 100 years ago, opens the first self-service supermarket. It introduces checkout stands, individual price markings, and shopping carts. And every now and then I will have in my audience somebody from Memphis who talks about Piggly Wiggly. It's still a big chain. It's not what it was, but it's still a very popular chain throughout the South. And that is a picture of opening day at Piggly Wiggly 100 years ago. And look, you have, I think it's 3 aisles. I know you have 635 individually priced items for sale. It looks like men are doing most of the shopping today, and they're coming out. You can see the cashiers at the checkout stands. So art and leisure 100 years ago. Picasso. Picasso holds the Guinness Book of Records for being the most prolific artist ever. There's about 10,000 works attributed to him, anywhere from, he made coasters to napkins to sculptures to painting. So if you went into a museum 100 years ago, you might see this, his Cubist painting, the guitar. And I purposely put this picture of Picasso up because we're used to seeing him, I think, as a much older man. I'm used to thinking of Picasso when he was in his 60s or 70s, but 100 years ago, Picasso looked like that. And of course, I talk a lot about books. I lecture a lot about books. I'm excited that you are having a book fair, which sounds wonderful to me. But 100 years ago, Agatha Christie introduced to the world Hercule Poirot. It's the very first Poirot story. It's called The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And Agatha Christie has the record for being the best-selling author, living or dead, ever. She has sold over 2 billion books and counting, and she died in 1976. But the Agatha Christie estate has kept Hercule Poirot going. They hired Sophie Hannah. You may know her work. I think she wrote The Nightingale. Very, very good author. So the Agatha Christie estates hire Sophie Hannah, and she is continuing to write Hercule Poirot mysteries. This one just came out 100 years after he was introduced to the world, and her work is very good. It's not Christie, but it's very good. And let's talk about sports for a bit. So the inaugural PGA was held 100 years ago, a little bit more, in 1916. It was won by a British fellow who became an American citizen. His name is Long Jim Barnes. And then it was abandoned. So it's played for the first time in 1916. It's abandoned, and it comes back in 1919. And in the arena of baseball, of course, you have to talk about Babe Ruth. Led the Red Sox to 3 series wins, 29 homers 100 years ago in 1919, the greatest draw in baseball ever. And what do the Red Sox do? You know that. They sell him. In December of 1919, they sell him to the New York Yankees. He's 25 years old. He brings down on the Red Sox the curse of the Bambinos. They took them 86 years before they won another series game. But I know you Texans, you love your Astros, and I think there's an Astro game going on tonight. I heard it in the background when some of you were coming in. And did you know that the Houston Chronicle was the first newspaper in the country to deliver World Series news by airplane? Actually, they used 2 airplanes. Look at the date. Practically, we're right there in October 1st, 1919. Evidently, Texans just loved the World Series even 100 years ago. So this series was interesting. It was 8 games. The Cincinnati Reds beat the White Sox 5-3. And this was the game of the big White Sox scandal. I remember reading about it. I think it was 8 players were accused of throwing the game. They were called the Black Sox. The players were tried. They were actually acquitted, but they were banned from baseball forever. But the Houston Chronicle rents 2 planes, and they fly them to more remote areas in Texas, and they drop the newspapers out of the plane. So this is from the Houston Chronicle, and the red arrow is pointing to the bundles of newspapers. They're putting them on the plane, and then there's the captain and the co-pilot, and they're just going to fly along and throw the newspapers on the ground so everybody can get the World Series results. Well, by now you're probably asking, well, what about women? You know, what kind of sports did they play 100 years ago? Not many sports, some amateur sports, but very little in the way of professional sports, aside from tennis. But there's a reason why not too many women played tennis in 1916. Look at what you had to wear. I mean, can you see yourself running over the court in that long skirt, holding the skirt up, trying to hit the ball with the racket, trying to keep your hat on your head? But in 1919, the Wimbledon player, Susan Lengren, came out on the court in that outfit, which she had just created. And oh my gosh, you can see her arms, you can see her legs, and she won Wimbledon that year. So she reinvented women's tennis with that outfit. So I've spent a lot of time, I talk about 100 years ago a lot, and you think about, who do you think the most influential person of the whole 20th century might be? If you had to choose one person, would it be, I hear some of you thinking FDR, and some of you might be thinking Gandhi, and I always get somebody who thinks Winston Churchill. But if we go with Time Magazine's choice for the most influential person of the past 100 years, it's Albert Einstein, was named the person of the century for all of his work in physics and E equals MC squared. So I thank you so much for letting me into your home. I give you my email address if any of you want to email me a question or a comment. I said that I have many reading lists. Ask me for a reading list. I'm happy to send one out to you, especially you might like my reading list on Murder in Michigas, the Jewish detective. So drop me a line. If you don't copy that down, I know that Barbara and Vicki know how to reach me. So thank you. It was my pleasure. Thank you so much. And I'm going to take my screen down. Oh my gosh, there you are. Hello.
Well, I found this just fascinating. I learned so much, and as you were talking about baseball and the cheating White Sox, we have cheating Astros too. So there are a lot of similarities, but they did win tonight. But it was really, I learned a lot. It was amazing. Someone pointed out, and there's a chat box, that Arizona does not do daylight savings. They stick with the same time all year round. So I did want to point that out.
Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. So if, most of them are just very interesting. Thank you very much. But if anyone does have questions, now's the time to write something in the chat box. I guess the one question I have, and you touched on it, so with the pandemic, which is called the Spanish flu, but it really wasn't from Spain, it was basically, there was no vaccine, and they took aspirin or whatever, and it just, what did you say, something like 600,000 people died?
675,000 people in this country, 50 million people throughout the world died.
It just worked its way, and people...
Right. They went for immunity. Enough people got it. Something like 70 to 80% of people have to have it for the virus just to sort of weaken and go away. It took 2 years. What I didn't say was that I wanted to mention that very responsible for bringing the virus to this country were the soldiers. Our American soldiers were overseas fighting. They got the virus. And if they didn't get it, they certainly got it on the way over. The troop ships were packed, and the health professionals begged the military not to pack the troops in so tightly on the troop ships, but military didn't listen. So the soldiers came back and they brought the flu with them. So that was the second wave. That's why 1918 was so bad. By the third wave, the third wave wasn't too bad. It sort of was trickling out by then. But there was nothing you could do for the Spanish flu, really.
But because the government decided to kind of keep it quiet, and it was being passed around more through the military initially, it wasn't as much a news topic daily. Like people really didn't know everything that was happening like we know almost to the minute.
You know, it's interesting. You're right that the newspapers today, I mean, I can't pick up a Sun Sentinel any day without them blaring the news about the coronavirus, but they did not do that 100 years ago. Many, many newspapers just sat on the news because the government was trying to, you know, pretend it didn't exist.
So it wasn't a big political topic.
No.
The election in
No, not at all. No.
And the other thing, and I don't want to monopolize, if anyone has comments, they asked, well, is there a recording? And we are recording this. So I'll talk to Jennifer and we'll see if we can make this recording available. The other thing I found fascinating when you talked about Louis Brandeis and his, because they keep saying nothing, the past few years are the first years it's been so contentious, but you're saying, no, it really was. It
was so ugly. You know, when you go back and you read the articles about Louis Brandeis and what he went through to become the justice. And I have to say, Woodrow Wilson would not withdraw support from him. Brandeis had been an advisor of Wilson's in 1912, and Brandeis was behind a lot of those progressive laws that Wilson was having enacted. And so Wilson remained very loyal to Brandeis, and it took a very long time for Brandeis to get on the court, but he did. He prevailed.
Anyone else? You want to type any questions? Anyone else have any questions? Or I want to thank you. I appreciate your taking the time. I can tell you actually.
I'm going to miss you guys. We've met so much.
I know. You got to come to Houston. We have a great congregation.
Well, if I ever do.
Community, and you know, we'd love to have you join.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure. Remember, if you want to just email me something, Barbara or Vicki has my email. And thank you, everybody. Be well. Stay well.
Next time we'll have to do your next one.
I love it.
Michigas.
Murder in Michigas.
Murder in Michigas. There you go.
Just give me a call. Take care. Thank you.
Thank
you. Bye. Just announcement, we will be having a Torah Fund event. It won't be like the ones in the past. It will be a virtual Torah Fund, but we've teamed up again with the ERJCC Book and Art Fair, and we have a speaker who will, and it will be about an hour long, similar to this. His name is Tommy Schnurmacher, and he wrote a book about his mother when she was in Auschwitz and how her vanity saved her life. But the book is really more his biography. I hear he is a just delightful speaker. He's a radio talk show host up in Canada. And I think we'll have a great program. So it is on Tuesday, November 17th. It's over the lunch hour at noon, open to anyone. It is our annual Torah Fund, and all our proceeds, we're not keeping any of the money. It all goes straight to the JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary. So you'll get a notice about it tomorrow, but I hope you'll join us for that one too. And if anyone has any questions, you know, I think you put it in the chat, but if not, thank you again for joining us. It was really a great program, and appreciate your support of Sisterhood.
And hope you all enjoyed it. And again, we appreciate.
One final thank you, if people still on. We need to thank Jennifer Rosenzweig. She's the magic behind the screen.
Thank you.
Set it up.
You're doing a great job, both of you.
We can
Vicki and Barbara, your notes and everything that comes through is excellent. You're doing a very good job.
Well, thank y'all
Okay,
again.
people.
All right,
Have a good
Thanks,
evening.
everyone. Good night.
good night.